Okay.
for Zoom.
Yeah. And so how do I just advance?
Yeah, I think there's a slide advancer here too.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see. Yep. So it looks like that's working fine.
And this goes back.
Yep.
Could I go ahead and apologize in advance? My name's Joe Guthrie.
Oh, hey, Joe.
I got about half of my risk management clients here.
All right,
They
good.
have class from 1220 to 110. Some of them have a class at 130. They're going to stick around as long as they can, and I've asked them
Okay.
when they need to, they're going to leave discreetly. But I don't
Good.
want you to feel bad about
No, that's okay.
much of that back row walking out on you
Be
partway
like,
through your talk.
geez, I'm really boring, right? That's
Exactly. So I just apologize for that.
they're bailing, right.
We're so excited to have you here. I just
Okay.
said, hey, instead of having class today, we're going to have.
What do you guys are like particularly studying, or what
The
might
classes-
they find of interest?
Sure. The class is actually in risk management and agriculture. One of the reasons that I tied it in was you had a brief snippet there about Africa from the 1930s,
Right.
really producing as North America did.
Right.
We had just finished talking about the Farm Bill,
Right.
and how the Farm Bill came in America, and there was policy differences that really transformed American agriculture in some ways that would not have been without the Farm Bill.
Right.
So one thing I want to say is, okay, here's North America, here's Africa, without Farm Bill before the 1930s, and the differences between those two continents
Right.
later on. And I'm well aware that's not the only difference between
Right.
the two cultures.
Right.
But that was one thing that I found of interest. I thought the class, we could go back and
Right.
discuss a little bit.
Sure,
How
okay.
the policy differences between the two cultures made some differences in agricultural production.
Exactly. And so I guess what I can point out with these smallholder farmers is how they basically, they're kind of in a time warp. I mean, they're the way they farm now is kind of, as they were doing, kind of in the 1920s when.
My father was born in 1925. He walked behind a horse that was pulling a plow
Right.
until he was 18 years old.
Right.
He got drafted for World War II in 1943 and got 4F from the Army because his back was already bad from having
Right.
walked behind a horse
Yep.
pulling a plow. And it's not that much different between that and Africa in 1925 and 1935.
Right.
So, and then here we
And-
have the
and-
vast differences now.
And in 2019. Right.
Yes.
So back then they were similar.
Right.
And now it's like
And
they're
now
still
it's vast
doing that.
differences.
Right. Yep.
And so by the time my dad, retired, we were, had a 125 horsepower tractor instead of 2 horses pulling.
Yeah. Exactly. Right.
What changed? What didn't change?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Give me sound in your presentation.
No. In this one, no. I mean, I can show. Do you need it or?
No. I have it muted right now just in case it's like notifications or anything, so they won't hear it to the speakers in here.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because some of the stuff in the film. No. So this slide presentation goes on to explain some of the things that are in the film in terms of how they've made progress since. Right. Yeah. Okay. No. So I'll skip the film.
Well, if you do need sound, you could just turn it up here.
Yeah.
I just have it muted for now.
Yeah. I didn't even know where the film is. No, it's not on here. So
It's not on there. No.
we'll forget it. We'll be better off with that.
If you have any problems, just let me know.
Is there a restroom?
Do I just hit the live stream when we're ready to start?
It's already Yep. So everything's set.
Okay, so I don't need to do anything.
Nope,
other
should be
than
all set.
dim the lights.
Yep.
Okay,
If you have any problems, let the front office know. They can call me. I can come down, but I don't think we'll have any issues.
perfect, thank you.
So, this is you hear it? Okay.
Yeah, going back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah, it's just Good afternoon, everyone. Joe, can I get a good afternoon? Thank you. So, thanks very much for coming to this special event, and really appreciate your attendance. I think we have a lot of students in the audience, and it's great especially to see you here. The College of Agriculture and Life Sciences fosters thriving communities through learning, discovery, and outreach about food systems, ecosystems, and animal and human health and well-being. The mission of global programs in the college, that is, CALS Global, is to build partnerships, create opportunities, and empower success to serve globally. We build local and global partnerships for the college and for Virginia Cooperative Extension that enable our students and faculty to be globally engaged and impactful. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues in CALS Global who have made this possible, especially Ann Steensland, Ben Grove, Nicole Martin, and Lisa Poley. Thank you very much for your help with this. Virginia Tech is the home now for the Global Agricultural Productivity Report, or GAP report. The GAP report tracks global progress in agricultural productivity growth and its role in environmental sustainability, food security, and poverty reduction. The 2019 GAP report will be released at the annual World Food Prize event next month. The GAP initiative is a series of activities and events designed to connect Virginia Tech students and faculty with leaders in the global fight to end hunger and malnutrition, including, of course, Roger Thoreau. Now, after Roger's comments, Dr. Guru Ghosh will facilitate a question and answer time. I think most of you know who Dr. Ghosh is, but in case you've forgotten, he joined Virginia Tech in 2011 from the College of William and Mary. Since 2013, he has served as Vice President for Outreach and International Affairs here. Thank you very much for joining us, Guru. Roger Thoreau joined the Chicago Council on Global Affairs as Senior Fellow on Global Food and Agriculture in January 2010 after 3 decades as a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. For 20 years, he was a foreign correspondent based in Europe and Africa. His coverage of global affairs has spanned events such as the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, the end of apartheid, wars in the former Yugoslavia, and the humanitarian crises of the first decade of this century, along with 10 Olympic Games. In 2003, Roger and his colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Scott Kilman, wrote a series of stories on famine in Africa that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting. Their reporting on humanitarian and development issues was also honored by the United Nations. Thoreau and Kilman are authors of the book Enough: Why the World's Poorest Starve in an Age of Plenty. In 2009, this book was awarded Action Against Hunger's Humanitarian Award. And Roger, I'd like to point out that of all of your books, which I've enjoyed, Enough has been particularly influential for me. This was published in 2009. I think I discovered it in 2011. Soon thereafter, I assigned it as required reading in one of my soils classes. And the other thing that makes this very influential for me is that a prominent character in this book is Norman Borlaug, who has been one of my personal heroes for many years. And if you don't know Norman Borlaug's name, he's the agronomist who in 1970 won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work, his leading work in the Green Revolution. Roger's also the author of The Last Hunger Season, A Year in an African Farm Community on the Brink of Change, and his most recent book is The First 1,000 Days, A Crucial Time for Mothers, Children, and the World, published in 2016. Please join me in welcoming Roger.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the commercial interlude and the plugs of the book. I appreciate that. I'm going to take my jacket off. Is that all right? Keep it on. case it slumps down and ends up on the floor. See, I've already screwed this up. So I was with the Wall Street Journal for 30 years, and for most of the time, at that time at the Wall Street Journal, we didn't even run pictures or photos. They were all little dot drawings. Everybody I interviewed thought I was going to do a dot drawing of them, and I said, yeah, no, that's much more talented people who do those things. So I said, yeah, the most I'll do is like take your photo and send it off for a dot drawing for those guys to do it. But so my technological capabilities lack. So yeah, we should start with that. So yeah, thanks for the mention of the 3 books. So I refer to the 3 books as the real Hunger Games trilogy. As I said in the previous, I hope nobody is, don't wait for Jennifer Lawrence to join us. She's not coming. Unless you've arranged that. I don't know, Ann, if there's a secret surprise thing. But it's the real Hunger Games trilogy because it deals with hunger and malnutrition in our world today and the very realness of it. It's not in some dystopian society. These aren't things in hunger and food security and malnutrition that happen in some faraway place. So over there somewhere, they're also, as I think we're probably all aware of, and all too painfully aware of, it's also present in our own midst. Across the country, certainly across the state of Virginia, West Virginia, in our cities and in our campuses. So in the midst of us all here, there's a certain amount of food insecurity with some of the students. It's kind of a dark underbelly of America. Hunger has, I think, been a part of this country going way back to Jamestown. There was much starvation in those early days. And so it's, something, unfortunately, that's kind of an unknown or unrecognized, unacknowledged part of our character, I think, far too often, which allows it to remain too often in the shadows. And so I guess this afternoon what I'll do is the middle book of the trilogy, The Last Hunger Season. To talk about that, because I think it probably applies to a number of the students and classes that are kind of involved in this. And I'll go kind of through some slides, indeed, how these farmers can go from survive to thrive. At the core of each of the books is a central outrage. So my motto, my mantra as a journalist is to outrage and inspire. So if you would see me in my frequent bouts of writer's block, it wouldn't be pretty, but I'd be kind of mumbling to myself, outrage and inspire, outrage and inspire. So how do I, through my narrative, and how to connect with readers, hopefully those readers come to care about the very real characters in the book and the real people that I'm writing about, then they come to care about the issues. And so how can I manifest that? And at my role as a journalist that I see kind of in the great struggle to and challenge to end hunger and malnutrition, I'm not a seed scientist or somebody who works at an NGO or a farmer myself, but I'm a journalist, and so what I could do is raise the clamor and outrage and inspire. And so at the core of every book is a central outrage. The first one, Enough, why the world's poor, starving, why the world's poor, starving, in age of plenty, that Tom referred to, is that how, in heaven's name, we brought hunger and malnutrition with us into the 21st century, into this grand new millennium of ours, with all the scientific accomplishments and achievements of the previous century and then the most recent decades. Tom referenced Norman Borlaug and the tremendous work that he had done in sparking the Green Revolution and the father of the Green Revolution, winning not a Nobel Science Prize, but the Nobel Peace Prize for, as the Nobel Prize Committee said at the time in awarding that, for cutting the Gordian knot at the time, this race between increasing population and food production, because there was a general fear and anxiety that, population was growing so fast that are we going to be able to keep up with food production? So by his work in the wheat fields of Mexico and then transporting that to the subcontinent in Pakistan and India and then that growing to other places, was able to put us ahead of that race. So cutting that Gordian knot that the Nobel Peace Prize Committee had seen. And so despite all that and all those accomplishments, and as I said, the science and the technology, the precedent that we know how to do this, we can end hunger and malnutrition and conquer famine, but that it still abides, and that we had brought us with us into the 21st. Again, despite all the communications capabilities literally at our fingertips, that we allow this medieval suffering to abide and persist kind of in our presence. And so here we are in 2019, and the latest numbers from the United Nations and the Food and Agriculture Organization, the numbers are on the march again, northward. And the numbers of food insecure, both chronically hungry, micronutrient deficient, are now generally for the first time matched by the number of obese and overweight in the world, about 2 billion each. So basically more than half the population is of our planet is malnourished in some sense. And on top of that, kind of the abiding problems of childhood malnutrition and stunting that comes from that, and kind of this life sentence of underachievement and underperformance. Of 1 in every 4 children under 5 in our world today is stunted in some manner. That fact is the core central outrage of my most recent book, The First 1,000 Days. So what are we doing? 1 in every 4 children under 5 in our world today are stunted. Sentenced to this life sentence of underachievement and underperformance. Stunted children become stunted adults, and it impacts all of us. And it's a quite profound impact. And I can talk more about that later if we'd like to, if we have the time. For this book, though, The Last Hunger Season, the central outrage in the core, and it grows out of enough, and how we had brought hunger and malnutrition, this obscenity, this shamefulness with us into the 21st century. Coming from that and doing the reporting on that, and with all my work at the Wall Street Journal, the cruelest irony in our world today, so the central outrage then of the Last Hunger Season book, is that the hungriest people in our world are farmers. So it is hideous, stupid, obscene, shameful oxymoron of hungry farmers. What's that about? How can these people who rise every morning, their task, and these ones are in Western Kenya, the ones that I followed, they step out the door of their little huts in the morning, and there's their fields, and their task is to grow enough food, hopefully just to feed their families, maybe a surplus that they can sell, help to feed the community, but then to sell to be able to afford other things, a better house, a solid roof, a metal roof on the house, maybe a little more land to grow crops on, to diversify, to be more nutritious. How can these farmers so often fail to even feed their families throughout the year and descend into this period known as the hunger season? It's an annual event. It's not on anybody's calendar, but it comes around as basically kind of any holiday. It's a season of the year. It's the period of profound deprivation from the time when the previous harvest is exhausted. It's all either consumed by the family, or it's consumed and sold for money to send the kids to school, to pay for school fees, to pay for medicine, malaria medication, any respiratory medicine, so anything on that front, to repair the roof or the walls, the mud brick walls of the houses after a pouring rain, whatever they would need to have a surplus for, or to use their crops in their harvest. So from the time of year, from the time when the food from the previous harvest runs out and the next harvest comes in, that's the period known as the hunger season. It can last, from a week to months. To one of the families in the book, it went on, and the family that we'll see, it lasted for about 10 or 11 months of the year. It's a profound deprivation where food is conserved, where the meals will shrink from 3 a day to 2 to 1 to none on some days, to maybe some days where there's just a weak cup of tea and maybe porridge that's left over. Maybe for the second day, the families physically shrink, and you can see it in their bodies. The cruel part of the cruelness of it is that it kind of happens at the time when the labor on their farms is most demanding. It would be, again, leading up to the next harvest, so it would be maybe during the planting season, during all the tending in the fields. It's done by most of it manual labor. In the instance of a lot of the smallholder farmers, Joe, as we were talking about, I mean, these farmers basically working and existing in a time warp. You know, there's the great book and then the movie, maybe that we're more familiar with, Out of Africa by Karen Blixen. What she describes in there, basically, I think coming up on say, like 100 years ago, I think it was early last century when that book came out. The description of the farmers in Kenya there by her farm are pretty much the same as the labor that the farmers do today. The working, the plowing with a hoe, and for a lot of the women, it's a short-handled hoe, so they're bending deeply. I mean, it's back-breaking work. You'll see the planting of the seeds, the bending over to be precise for a seed per hole, the microdosing of fertilizers. Not any of that goes to waste. So just anybody with an idyllic, a nature that has some kind of idyllic pastoral view of farming, of smallholder farming in Africa, that's the furthest from the truth. I mean, it's really, really hard labor, and for most years, having to endure then this insult of a hunger season on top of it. And so, yeah, the farmers in the field, the children having to study in that situation. A number of the times then the children, so what I did in the book, I followed 4 smallholder farmers in Western Kenya to get to this core of hungry farmers and this hideous oxymoron. I followed 4 smallholder farmers and their families in Western Kenya through the course of the year, and the year was 2011. And there were children in each of the families, and sometimes that the kids would come home, like say at lunch break, having had basically nothing for breakfast, and then walking off to school, maybe up to a mile or two, to their classrooms, coming home for lunch, and the first thing they would do is they'd go look at the little hut where the fire would be, the cooking fire. And if when they went in they saw that there was no fire, they knew there would be no lunch. And so then they would basically sit down maybe in the shade to cool off, but then there were still chores to be done. Then maybe an hour later, they're back to school again. Then they come home for at the end of the school day, again, first thing to the cooking hut, is there a fire? And so that may go on for a couple of days where there might not be any food. So how do you study? How do you prepare for test, for advancement from one class to another, from primary school to high school? So that it impacts all aspects of life and becomes all pervasive. So what I'll do is I'll go through the life in that year of one of the families, the Biketi family. Of the 4 families, they were the poorest. When I started the reporting in January of 2011, they were already in the midst of the hunger season because the harvest is September or so. The staple crop is corn, maize, which they'll eat, maybe several times a day, every day of the week, maybe with some diversity, but in a lot of cases not, and in various forms that they would eat the maize. And their harvest was paltry the year before. So that's their house. So you can kind of see they have kind of on that side of the house, kind of beyond the trees, they have basically a nice rectangular lot that's about an acre. That year, so in 2010, they only had the resources, the money to plant a quarter of an acre to be able to afford the seed. I don't think they used any fertilizer. And so they planted a quarter of an acre. Their yield that year was 200 kilogram bags of maize. Family of 4. So there's 4 children with the mom and the dad. And that lasted, just the family consumption of it, lasted a couple of months. Sapora, the mom, her father passed away, and so then everybody is expected to contribute to kind of the feast that they'll have at the funeral. So by November, late October, early November, everything was gone from the previous harvest. So I start reporting in January when they're already, say, a month into the hunger season. the deprivation beginning to set in, still conserving a little bit of what they have. But that's their house. It's thatched roof, mud brick walls. Kind of one of the ironies of smallholder farmers in Africa in many instances is that they live in these they're extraordinarily poor, but they live in these extraordinarily rich settings. There are people, I'm sure, in this room and in this country who would pay any amount of money to live in a setting like that and have the view that they have. Those are the Elgin Mountains on the Ugandan border in the distance, so it's a commanding view. The rocks here, it's rocky. So here provides a commanding view of the whole area. So it's this gorgeous, rich setting with this tremendous poverty kind of in the midst of it. I'm going to do this. Yay, bravo. You see, there's a close-up of the place. So they had a couple, so this is like early in 2011 when I'm first meeting the Bacchetti family. So here's their field, right? So you can see that. And yeah, it's about an acre, but again, only able to plant a quarter of it. So again, thatched roof on their house, mud brick walls. So everybody's waiting for the rainy season to come so they can plant, but ooh, the rains are strong. So a lot of times they'll break through. It'll cause leaking in the thatched roof. If a lot of times if the rain's coming sideways, it pounds into the mud brick. So they're having to go into triage at the same time that they're planting and kind of repair everything with it. It's basically kind of a one room that's divided into a couple of areas, like with a bedroom for the parents and for the kids, and then kind of a very humble seating area. And the cooking is also done inside the hut. And so it's that the inside cooking over an open fire. That one is dangerous and it's very unhealthy. And so just for, kind of what it does to the lungs and the breathing, and then particularly for the smaller kids. So right away in January, I'm meeting them, and as I say, they're in the midst of the hunger season. That's Sephora, the mom, and 3 of the children. Cynthia, Tabitha are the girls. David, the little boy, he's 2 and 3 years old in the course of the reporting of the year. And so you can already see that he's reflective of the manifestly malnourished. He has a distended belly. His hair is mottled, and he has a constant cough. And so we always knew where David was by the cough was almost like a bell around a cow or a cat that you can then see where they are based on that noise. So if they didn't kind of know where David had gotten off to, just after a while there'd be kind of a rough cough and be like, David's up in the rocks, or he's with the lone cow or something. And then Sephora, the mom. I mean, looking at in her eyes, I mean, already the kind of desperation, the frustration, almost the desperation, the verge of like giving up of what's going to happen. Kind of what does the future hold? The girls just already starting to become very thin and kind of shrink as the hunger season, just as at the outset. So that's how they were at the beginning. So Sephora knew that, well, I can't have the next year. So this is January. They're waiting for the rains to come. Hopefully in February, March sometime when they can begin the planting. And they want 3 days of rain before they begin the planting. Otherwise, it'd be rain for 1 day. Ooh, then we'll plant. Oh, now there's no rains for another week, and that seed is basically lost by that time. And so they have kind of their traditions that they watch for now with all the weather forecasts and everything. So they can be pretty precise on when the planting season is. So they're waiting for that. But in the meantime, so into their community and into their area, then comes the One Acre Fund. So it's an American NGO started by Andrew Yoon, who was like a marketing major at getting his post-grad at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. Through various kind of serendipitous factors, he ends up in this area of Western Kenya. He's like just looking around. He's really into kind of distribution of products. He was in South Africa looking at kind of distribution of AIDS medicine to the doctors, to nurses, to clinics. How can we do that more efficiently to make that go better? How can we bring the prices down? And he was curious about rural Africa. So somebody said, oh, I got a brother or somebody who lives up in Western Kenya. Go there. So goes up to Western Kenya, and there he, after poking around a little bit, he sees kind of two farmers on like opposite sides of the pathway. One was like in the midst of the hunger season and really desperation and deprivation and the kids, you know, obviously malnourished. The other side of the road, that farmer was doing well, had had a good harvest, still had a good stockpile, seemed to have conquered the hunger season for that year. His children were in school. The other ones were kind of in and out of school because they were hungry or they didn't have the funds, the fees to the minimal basic fees to go to school, and wearing rags. And so it was like, what's the difference between these? Why is that happening? Then it was the one that was more prosperous. He discovered, oh, they had the access to the essential elements of farming that we all take for granted. So the proper seeds, quality seeds, and they're, you know, hybrid seeds, or even the land variety of seeds that they'll keep from year to year. There's no GMOs involved. But just the proper seeds for the soil, for the climate, for the rain levels, for the altitude where they are, had enough money for little microdosing levels of fertilizer. Their fertilizer is maybe the equivalent of a beer bottle cap per maize seed that they put in the ground. For the bean seeds, it'll be a third, and they measure that so judiciously because they don't want to waste any. Because even in that small amount, the fertilizer is very expensive. They had extension advice, basically better extension advice how to plant, and then they had some financing to be able to pay for all this to begin with. The other family basically didn't have any resource to even get started, had no access to funding, no access to capital, so how are they even going to get the seed and the fertilizer to start? So here comes One Acre Fund. So Andrew then puts that together. He says, oh, maybe it's a distribution method. How do we make these essential elements of farming, the seed, the fertilizer, the extension device, the financing, which is the lifeblood of farmers anywhere in the world, how do we make that available to these, that all farmers can have that? And that was part of then what was going on that caused this kind of, you know, massive difference that you know, Joe and I were also talking about, the difference between, and this huge gap that had grown up between American farmers and the farmers in Kenya and Africa. They were so far behind farmers anywhere else in the world. You were saying, you know, your parents and relatives that kind of farmed in you know, with manual labor, right?
Yeah, my dad in the 1930s was walking behind
Yep.
a horse that was pulling a plow.
Exactly. So hand labor, hand farming, manual farming. That is still what these farmers are doing. We've really gone past that through the Farm Bill, through other aid to the farmers, to making these essential elements of farming available to all the farmers in America to be able to have that. These farmers basically having none of that for various circumstances that we can get into as well, and kind of all kind of that was conspiring against them. Because the Green Revolution that really took off in Asia, India, Pakistan, China, other parts, Brazil, never basically got to Africa, also for various reasons. We kind of turned our back on the smallholder farmers kind of starting in the 80s or so. Investments basically fell off the end of the table. We figured, oh, those farmers, they should be off in industry making, you know, socks and underwear because we don't do that anymore. So yeah, they should do that. And if they need food, well, they can get that. They can buy that from us. Or the farmers in Europe or elsewhere because they're subsidized by their governments, the prices are lower. And if they don't have enough food or they can't afford it, oh, well, we'll send it over in food aid. So that's also one of the cruel ironies. The majority of recipients of food aid around the world are farmers. And so that's, again, a terrible irony and paradox. So the One Acre Fund, so Andrew sets that up in Western Kenya, this market package of the delivery of all of these essential elements of farming to the farmers on kind of a microcredit thing. So it provides the lending available for that. So Sephora hears of that because there's some farmers in the area that are already doing that. She just sees how their farms are doing better. In fact, kind of the ones across the little passage, the pathway, the narrow dirt road, they had joined the One Acre Fund, and you could see how their crops were thriving, and kind of a doubling, tripling, quadrupling of production in just 1 year. And so this year she says, I'm going to join that. So beginning of 2011, she's signing up for the One Acre Fund. Something's got to happen. I got to do something. I can't. This deprivation is too great for my family. So she signs up. So here then is the principle of that the farmers will get together. At this time it was the church in the area, and kind of then trucks, they're filled with seed, fertilizer, that's brought to the farmers. So normally it would be, oh no, you got to walk like 2 or 3, hours to this guy who's selling these farm inputs over off the main road, and that's great for like the bigger farmers. They got trucks, they can go over there, pick it up and go. How are they going to get there? The rains have come. Oh, now I need my seed, my little bit of fertilizer, and I got to go to this guy, and then they get there. No, we're sold out. What do you want? No, we don't have that specific thing or variety. So One Acre then basically delivers it to where they are. So they all line up for that, including Sephora. So there she is. So she doesn't have any transport, and her farm's not that far away. But there's guys on motorcycles then who are entrepreneurial, come by, and just for a couple of cents, they'll say, oh, we'll transport this back to your farm. And so they basically load the seed, the fertilizer, on their motorcycle. Sephora jumps on. For the first time in my life, I have access to these products. I'm not letting this guy speed away with these without me being on the back of this. So she sits on top of it, right? This guy's not going anywhere out of my reach. And I already paid him a couple of a shilling or two to take that. So she's so proud. So there she is. She's off to her farm. Okay, so that comes. And now, so they have the inputs well in advance of like when the rains are expected to come. And now comes the extension advice. For the first time in their lives, hey, plant in straight rows. That's the string that they have. And then they tie little so bottle caps that they'll bend and they'll put on there, and they'll say, so it's every so many inches, proper distance, that's where you dig a hole. Proper spacing between the rows. The way they had basically planted is they would dig furrows, and then they would just scatter the seed as if you're, feeding chickens, or, you're kind of at one of the tables in Las Vegas and throwing the dice or something. That's what they would do with the seed. They would just scatter it. If a couple of seeds landed next to each other, that's probably okay, because at least one of them will grow. Well, as we all know, they'll kind of all start growing, but then they're in competition for the room, for the sunlight, for the water, for the soil nutrients, and they're all basically stunted. So here comes the advice, which to us would all be like, oh, yeah, well, that's obvious. But for them, it's quite revolutionary, actually revolutionary in practice. 1 seed per hole. What? I'm going to rely on that, my livelihood, my feeding to my kids, 1 seed per hole? Well, how's it been going so far? Well, yeah, well, we do have an annual hunger season. Okay, try it this way. So that leap of faith, which is why, because I said, okay, if One Acre Fund has been here, why are some farmers in One Acre Fund taking advantage of this and some aren't? Don't they see the advantages of this? But it would take time for them to say, oh yeah, I see. This is what I should do as well. So every year, then they would kind of have this growth as they go on. So the extension advice. And again, with the microcredits, the funding to pay for it. So it's maybe $50, $100, $70 per acre. Sephora has this acre, so what she was sitting on was basically enough for her 1 acre to plant. Rains come, planting season. They plant, follow everything. They kind of work together in groups. So there might be 10 together in a group of 1 acre farmers, and they're all helping each other on planting day. And they do the same on harvest day. And they'll help each other with the weeding and things. They go from farm to farm. So they kind of do that together. That helps with the manpower and the labor. So they don't have to drag the kids out of school to do that. So Sephora plants this, and it's like every day, then as it grows, it's like a Jack and the Beanstalk event. Now she walks out of her house, her little house in the morning. Right there is the field, and she cannot believe the robustness of the corn, the greenness of it all. So there they are, kind of in the middle of the planting season, and they're astonished. I mean, it's like over their heads. They've never seen that. A full acre of it. My goodness, what's going on? It's their version of a Grant Wood photo, right? Of standing in front of their crops and how proud they are, right? I should have had them with their djembes, their hoes. Now, a lot of the men, they'll have long-handled hoes because they're like, I'm not bending over to do that work. So somehow they like put a bigger stick on the end. But for the women, it's like, no, you stay with the small one. There's a practical nature of it that if they have small children and they're bending over to do the hoeing, the child that's on their back then is kind of in a horizontal position and easier to sleep and care for the child. But again, extremely painful and backbreaking for the moms. And the women do the vast majority of the subsistence farming in Africa. So subsistence farming, growing the crops that they actually eat at home, so as do maize. So Sanit, who's the husband, he's kind of there for some kind of guidance and moral support most of the time. He's trying to do something on the livestock side. So anyway, look at the crops grow. Harvest day arrives. Now they're like, these things are twice the size of the farmers. So they go through with their machetes, again, all by hand. They're bending over. The women will do, but then the men will join for that day as well, and they're bending over and cutting each stalk with their machetes. So the harvest is in. Then it comes time for the shelling. So there's little David now. So he's sitting on the floor. They actually have like little metal things that kind of help him with taking the kernels off. But that becomes a bit doesn't kind of always work so much. So some of my great days of the reporting of the story were actually sitting on the floor with them and shelling the maize, and you get into all sorts of great and glorious conversations at that time because neighbors will come by and the families kind of usually gathered for that. So David is really he's concentrating and working together on that. Shelling is done, maize is dried, harvest is in. They have it in bags. They store it in their bedroom because it's the room in the back. So it's away from prying eyes. Anybody who kind of comes into their house, they're not able to see. That bedroom was full to the top with bags. The previous harvest was 2 bags, 200-kilogram bags of maize. This year, 20. A 10-fold increase, ostensibly in their wealth. Gee, think if we had a 10-fold increase, a 10 times raise, right, in our salaries. It'd be like, goodbye job, fine, I'll take that for a year, then I'm off. I made so much. 20 bags. They couldn't believe it. It was such an abundance, right? They figured, well, maybe they need 10 bags of maize to make it through the year, to defeat the hunger season, to keep it home. Surplus for the first time in their lives. First time in their lives as farmers that they actually have a surplus crop. So it's there, it's stored in these bags. Hopefully, the weather won't ruin it if it's too humid. It's in their bedroom. They're making sure that the thatched roof is okay, so nothing's leaking in. Hopefully the pests and the bugs don't get to it, so they're kind of on guard against that, and the mice and things to protect that. My goodness, what are we going to do with all this? Their dream, so in the hunger season, they don't even have the luxury of ever dreaming. What are we going to do? I mean, of what can we do with our lives? It's like getting day by day, and you saw in that initial photo of them and support, the look on their eyes. I mean, just a desperation. I mean, you dream of something for the future. So on one of the trips I went back, the harvest is in, and they come out and they had a blueprint for a house they were going to build. Not a mud brick house, but a house of solid bricks. And their calculations, sheets. How many metal sheets do we need for the roof? We're tired of the rain coming through our thatched. When you're into rural areas in Western Kenya or in many places of Africa, you can see kind of the increasing wealth or prosperity of a community based on the roofs of the housing. Is it a thatched roof? Is it a tiled roof? Is it a metal roof? Wow. So they have the calculation of that because they're figuring, okay, 20 bags, if we keep 10 bags, we can sell 10. This is kind of their calculations of how many bags I need, how many meters the sheeting is. Sanat was going to make his own bricks, which he did, kind of on the side of the house, of the old house. That's their plan. And as you can see, there's a bathroom, right? Well, they don't have indoor plumbing, but they would have a cistern outside and then have some kind of hose system come in and some kind of irrigation thing, essence that they were going to set up. For the first time, they could wash their hands, say, before they eat or before they go to bed. So health reasons. There's no kitchen on that or cooking thing. They were going to build a separate structure to do the cooking. No more indoor smoke and cooking. A great benefit for everybody, but particularly smaller kids. Private room or study. There's a place for the kids to actually sit and do their work, their homework. And maybe they can get a solar light so they can actually study later into the evening. So this is their ambitions. Wow, they have this blueprint. That kind of ends the narrative of the book that year, right? So it ends kind of at Christmas time or the end of the year, where they're all kind of having some kind of feast to celebrate. For the first time, we did not have a hunger season. We conquered the hunger season, which they call the Wanjala. Hopefully the Wanjala is chased away. The Wanjala will never visit again, the hunger season. And so I'm still curious then, obviously, as the reporting goes on, and just, you know, kind of, we're doing some film work also. So then, kind of in the year following then, I go back. Well, how's everybody doing? Oh, the house is coming up. There's the bricks that Senate has been. The old house is still there because they're not finished yet. And it's like, you know, we never had this luxury before. Are we going to be able to actually build this? So they're keeping the old house there. There's now a calf. I guess there's two. And so they're able to keep them, you know, which is better for them, and they can plan what to do with that. So then I go away, and then I come back again a number of months later. Oh, now the house is up. The old house is down. The new house is up with the metal roofing. So the progress that they made, all from that one better season. 2 bags of maize to 20 bags of maize. The access to the essential elements of farming that we all take for granted. Eliminating the Wanjala, the hunger season, and this hideous oxymoron of hungry farmers. So they got their nice house. David, remember him before? Distended belly, mottled hair. So that's all gone. He's looking sharp. He's in his school uniform. Oh, now he's in school. And yeah, he's one of the top guys in the class. So he comes home for lunch, and he's got milk in one cup and porridge in the other. David's a two-fisted drinker, right? So he's like proud of all this. Now look at the eyes of Zipporah, right? Contrasted to, do I have that old photo here? We got another photo coming up. But now look at her, right? Proud of her son. He's not hungry. He's not malnourished. From Zipporah, I learned the deepest depths of misery in the hunger season is to be a mother unable to stop the crying and silence the crying of a hungry child. And the misery of that. She felt that she was failing on 2 fronts. Both as a farmer, because she wasn't growing enough food to feed her family throughout the year, and 2, as a mom, because her children were malnourished. It's a horrible burden to bear. Now she is unburdened of that, and look at the pride and the satisfaction and the smile on her face. So I make another return visit, and there they are, the family photo in front of their house. Still not finished, but they're working on it. Contrast that photo to that one and to this one. So there was Zipporah with David and Cynthia and Tabitha, and there's David, and I think that's Cynthia and Zipporah. Now they're all smiling. I mean, my goodness, the difference that one harvest has, agriculture development, comes to Zipporah's house. That's the difference. That's going from just mere surviving to robustly thriving. And so that's kind of the essence of, and kind of the story arc that one follows in the book. And there's 4 families. And so in the other families, some of them have older children that are in high school, and the struggles to keep the boy in high school there. He was like the 4th oldest child in the family, and then there were 3 girls behind him. And the 3 older ones in Leonida's family, they never made it through high school. They just didn't have the funds for it. But that boy who was in high school during the course of reporting, he was always like the clever one in the family. He was like wanting to read things. Basically, the only book they had was the Bible, so he was kind of reading that and whatever other materials he could get. That, Leonida said, is the one who's going to go to high school, and then he's going to help and to get a job, and so his sisters, who are younger than him, can go to school. The struggles that they go through and the sacrifices, I think her yield was maybe 12 bags of maize, because she was also growing some sugarcane on her plot and some other vegetables. She sold it all to basically ensure that they had the school fees for him in high school, because the fees are more expensive, knowing that, yeah, the rest of us are going to go through the hunger season. We're all going to shrink again. The girls will have a hard time studying. And so Gideon, the boy, there were times of the school year he didn't even want to come home because he knew the sacrifices that his family was making for him. It was too painful for him to see. So he was really diligent. And then the last time I was there, he was actually in agriculture college. He had actually finished 2-year. He made it through high school and then had finished a 2-year studying in agriculture school, maybe to be an extension advisor. So you can see all of that kind of comes from agriculture development, the access to the essential elements of farming that we all take for granted, and this whole notion and this challenge that we all face then of ending this hideous oxymoron of hungry farmers. And hopefully the takeaway from the book and from this story is that the more that these farmers survive, so it's not only an individual thing for them, and hooray for the Becchetti family, but the more that they are able to thrive and succeed, the more that we're all able to succeed, because we're all connected on the same global food chain, the more that we're able to succeed on this great task of feeding the world, nourishing the world, and ending the hunger seasons. So thank you. And there is a video online that's about 7 minutes that I think it's called The Last Hunger Season Revisited. It was filmed in 2017 that basically goes and then has updates more on what everybody is doing. So it's all 4 families and that you can see parts of. And how American leadership in global food security is so vital and has been part of our history since even before World War II. And that the U.S. leadership in this, the One Acre Fund, just being one example of kind of what America doing, and Norman Borlaug, basically Exhibit A in that. And so, anyway,
Thank you very
questions.
much,
Thank you.
Roger. And I'd like to invite Guru now to, I think you have some questions
Yes.
of your own, and then we open it up to the
Sounds good.
audience. So-
Thank you. Roger, thank you please,
No,
if
thank
you
you.
don't mind moving to that side, just take a little bit of acreage on this side of the desk.
Oh, now it's bright. I can see people, right? That's
Thank you for illuminating discussion. I have a 2-part question, after which I'll open it up to the audience to ask additional questions. First, in the landscape of American higher education, there seems to be a poverty of global engagement on the behalf of the student body of 19 million students in American higher ed at this time. And I oversee a Center for International Research, Education and Development, largely that's engaged in the world of global food security and USAID projects. One of the things that I've noticed over the last decade is fewer and fewer faculty and professional and agricultural specialists that are at the ages of 20, 30, 40. Most of them I find in the 50s and 70s range. And I wonder, how do we catalyze global engagement for the next generation of agricultural leaders in this country? And the second is, having grown up in Eastern India, much of my childhood was spent in Calcutta, but I would leave the urban mega centers on occasion to go out into the hinterlands of the country. And I would notice during my drives to the villages of India that the activity of the women in the rural regions of the country were so much greater than the activity of the men in terms of productivity in the fields and so on. So I wonder if you could take a moment to talk about agriculture and gender and development in that context as well.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. So India is parts on the first 1,000 days. I follow moms and their children through the 1,000-day period, which is the time from when a mom becomes pregnant to the second birthday of the child. It's about 1,000 days. In India, Uganda, Guatemala, and Chicago. And in India, it's in Uttar Pradesh, in the Rae-Bareli area. So got some, and the moms there, they're all, it's all rural settings. And yeah, you can see it's kind of the same here. The moms, women doing a lot of work in the fields. You know, and the men kind of whatever income that they can have, making bricks or doing whatever. It's kind of all hands on deck for folks. But to catalyze into global engagement of, this generation in particular, I think kind of the fall off in that, or kind of the gap that you noticed, is probably kind of a general, consequence of kind of what was going on in, say, the 90s, the 80s, the first part of this century, where there was kind of a disengagement from agriculture development. Because if you could, Norman Borlaug wins the Nobel Peace Prize. If he already got that, me as a researcher or something, well, I'm never going to win that because they're not going to give it to two agriculture people, right? One was like weird enough for the Peace Prize. So there's that, but I think there was a lot of like just patting on the back, congratulations, we did that, problem solved. Let's move on. There were some, then a generation still that was coming that were inspired by Dr. Borlaug, that he was a mentor for. But you kind of saw this became through the structural adjustment period, kind of by the World Bank, by the IMF, that was looking at kind of why poverty was persistent, why there were financial problems, not only in a number of the developing world, but like New York was bankrupt, Argentina had all sorts of problems, London was a mess. It was like this structural adjustment was then kind of this financial adjustment that, well, what are the governments doing in all these fields? And so in particularly in African developing world, it was kind of conditional on loans to those countries. Governments get out of parastatals and particularly agriculture. And so then the signal was out, and it was clear in the World Bank, and in conversations that I had with Dr. Borlaug, he would just rail against the World Bank for basically turning its back on agriculture. Inside the World Bank, it was wide known that if you wanted to advance, do not ponder agriculture development projects, because that was not the way up the ladder. There were other poverty reduction things. The advice to countries was, no, as I said, your farmers, the reason why they're poor, we're the big anti-poverty reduction agency in the World Bank. The reason why these people are poor is because they're farmers. Well, they should probably be doing something else, as opposed to, no, they're the majority of the population in a lot of these countries. The main labor and work is in the rural areas and is on the smallholder farms, and they're producing the majority of food in a lot of these countries. So it was like so wrong-sided and wrong-headed on a number of fronts. But so then it was like, oh yeah, agriculture is just out of fashion. And so I think there's kind of that, age factor or something that, why are we going to do that? Except those that were inspired by that and by the possibilities, and just if on studies they had seen something like that, like Andrew Yoon is like, well, that's not right. We can do something about that. But for kind of to catalyze their engagement, I think the great task that's coming up for this generation of students is kind of this next thing. So again, the Nobel Peace Prize, what they said was that Borlaug had cut the Gordian knot of the time of this race between population growth and agriculture and food production. He put food production out ahead of population growth. Now our new Gordian knot is this race between how do we nourish the planet going forward, how do we feed the planet, how do we nourish the planet going forward, and how do we preserve and protect the planet at the same time. Because a lot of agricultural activities emerging from the Green Revolution, some of them, are making that task more complicated. Agriculture's contribution to climate change, about 25%, a quarter of all if not more, of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from agriculture and land use. The monocropping that has gone on. So as we see here, kind of that we're so reliant on maize. They've been diversifying some. But the fields as you drive through here, I'm from Northern Illinois, went to school at the University of Iowa. It's wall-to-wall corn and soybeans. Monarch butterflies, which used to be so abundant, are kind of bypassing that because they don't care about corn and soybeans. They like the milkweed in particular. And well, no, under this ag system, there's no weeds to be found. Now farmers are actually planting milkweed again to bring back the pollinators. So to collapse a pollinator colonies. Kind of what's happening with the water runoff from the fertilizers, the pesticides that are wreaking havoc also with pollinators. So all these things that are essential, the depletion of the soils, the depletion of the water, all these things that are essential for the green revolution and to increase production, now in essence in kind of this weird twist are kind of more complicating that matter. So that's the task. How do we continue to increase production, agriculture production, but at the same time preserve our planet and to kind of anticipate things? So I think that's something that should really energize and catalyze this current generation, that this, I think, is the primary and supreme task that this generation is facing, because we haven't been able to figure out. We've actually exasperated it. And so similar on to climate change, where the students are leading and kind of in terms of raising the clamor a lot, it's this generation, particularly on the agriculture front, on protecting the biodiversity and protecting the planet, that is the students that this generation that then has to lead. So hopefully that's a catalyzing and a really energizing factor for that. I think that's a great task of, say, the land-grant universities. I mean, all universities. I mean, it's a matter of, kind of even the liberal arts schools. You need kind of the philosophers and the ethicists to get involved in this, kind of the ethics of agriculture and new crops and new ag system, right? How does that all play into things? And so I think that's all something that's really, should really hopefully energize things. And it's the same situation here, that how do these children who have seen their parents so struggle with agriculture and this handwork, this manual labor, and it's painful and it's tedious, and we still go through a hunger season. Why would they stay on a farm or do anything in agriculture? But as we say with Gideon, as his mom improved, it's like, I think the best thing that I can do for my community is learn agriculture and bring it back here and make sure. So the more that they kind of get engaged, so all these efforts to harness the youth of Africa, in particular, to get involved in agriculture, that's where it's happening. And even on an entrepreneurial front, I think is really great. And in ag and gender, yeah, I think that's kind of the cutting or the rock face of things, because women are doing the majority of the subsistence farming, at least, and the more that that they have the technology to make their jobs easier, to make them more productive, the more their education is, that they're able to apply that education to their agriculture, to the decisions that they make, which I try to unwrap some in the book, that education versus feeding the family, diversifying our crop, versus that may take some of the resources from the past crop. All those strategies that they come to then are kind of in essence quite sophisticated, but as they think through them. So the more education that they have, and again, I mean, Ann, what are the ratios? I mean, that women that are educated, their productivity levels, particularly in agriculture, soar by a certain degree. And so, so I think the gender is just so critical on all of this. So
Thank you, Roger. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's good to learn that we have a Hawkeye amidst us in the land of Hokies.
Yeah, exactly. Hokies, Hawkeyes. That's what I was thinking yesterday. That.
So questions from the audience for Mr. Thoreau? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for a really excellent and interesting talk. I read your book while I was in Kenya in June with Tom and Halsey.
Bless you. Thank you. You're the one, right? Somebody's read it, right? Thank you.
It was really interesting to get some further insights on some of the pictures and some updates on what's happening. I remember one thing you mentioned in the book was that education, as you mentioned just then, is sometimes the trade-off between educating your family or feeding your family. And you mentioned that the school fees were due, I think they were due, whenever it was the corn price was the maize price
Right.
was least. Is anything changed from that, or any policies within the government institutions?
Yeah, no, I don't think the government policies, because it was, so the school fees in Kenya basically due in January when the new school year would begin. And, for, if the harvest is in, if they're picking the corn in September, then the drying process, they don't have a sophisticated thing, so they just basically kind of lay it on a tarp in the sun. And if it rains, well, then they got to start all over again the next day. So that'll go on for a while. then the packaging, the putting it in the bags and storage and things. So basically, the maize then is all hitting the market because it all comes at the same time, and it hits the market at the same time in maybe November, December. So the prices are lowest, and that's the time. Well, then the school fees are due. So if you're having to sell your maize at that time, you're getting the lowest price of it. So then it was talk of, yeah, well, hey, government, can you be a little bit flexible in terms of when the school fees by the parents are due? And I think it was decided, yeah, no, or never got around to it because it would be a very bureaucratic thing. And the contributions that the government makes to the schools, that's always delayed. So that money would always maybe come in March or April, so well into the school year. So the principals are always like leaning on the parents. We need something to start off with. So you all, come up with the payments right away. So Leonida, so one of the moms, she sold the bulk of her harvest, so for the school fees for Gideon. And so for high school, it was maybe $300, or the equivalent of that for a school year. And she was just paying whenever she had a little bit. At one stage, she sold her little transistor radio to raise money because the headmaster basically sent him home and said, we run out of money from your family, so you need to go back home and get more money. And so they might sell a chicken, and at one time she sold a radio, so it was like very sad as she was going through that. And then the harvest comes in, it's like, okay, so I'm going to sell that to keep him in school. Then her hunger season hits basically on planting day, because her friends and neighbors that had come by to help her plant, her partners in her One Acre Fund group, then she had like a meal for them, and the maize she had used for that meal then was like the last of what she had, or so it was kind of that weird idea. She's planted, but then the hunger season now officially starts to bite. And so then she goes back to the market and buys maize from the same person that she sold it to, and the price that she was paying when she went back into the market was 4 or 5 times higher. In essence, I think if we had marked her kernels, would they have been the exact same ones that she sold to the guy who had better storage process? That would have been a really weird thing. I should have been on top of it right at the time and said, "Oh, you're selling this. Let's mark these things, right? Somehow, right? Or put them in like a coffee can and just have this guy store them. Put them in a separate bag for this guy, and then we'll do whatever you want with it. But when she comes back, so that was then it's then you're kind of nailed and crucified to the cross of the maize price, and so that then diversification of the crop becomes really important. So then basically a year or two after the book, this maize disease went through called the lethal necrotic maize disease, which is like a hideous name for it, and it seems redundant that if it's lethal and it's necrotic, isn't that right? Kind of the same thing. Just call it one or the other, like a lethal maize disease. And so you could see that marching across Kenya, and so the One Acre Fund, they're kind of looking at that and figured, oh, well, we got to do something. So they were quick with their research, found out like where this else had been, kind of what can we do about it, what kind of maize varieties are there that are out there for the farmers, and we're going to start offering loan packages around sorghum and millet as well. And so it was, okay, so they'll diversify. So on a nutritional basis, less desirable to eat just because of the color, particularly in the mealy pap. It's darker in color, so the kids would say it's like eating poop. So we don't want to have that. And the parents were like, "No, that's what we ate when we grew up. It's like nutritious and healthy," but it was like overcoming that factor for them. So some planted the sorghum and maize. So it then helped with the diversification. And those crops, then when they come to market, the pricing structure was totally different for them because there wasn't that much that was being planted in that area. So then the farmers could see that as well. Okay, it's more it has different nutrients in it, so it helps diversify our diets, but it helps us diversify our crop mix and our pricing mechanism. So that became kind of a silver lining in the lethal necrotic maize disease dark cloud that had hit them. And so, yeah, but the maize price is it's this double, triple, quadruple whammy that's on top of them already.
It was excruciating to read, and then especially when they come down with malaria at the same time and you can trade it.
Yeah, exactly. And so everybody in those communities is affected. So the lady, Janet, who was the pharmacist, everybody was basically on credit. So Leonida, she was a good friend, but she said, my kids have, she'd take her kids with her, and the pharmacist would, it looks like they have malaria, or, beginning of pneumonia or something. and here's the medicine for it. And she would say, I don't have any money for that. And so she'd run a tab on them. And then Janet was saying, how long can I do that? Because somebody's got to pay so I can buy other medicine to basically treat other people or to give away. So it impacts the entire community. It's not just the farmers, but it's like all the commerce in the area that's then impacted by it. But yeah, an inflexibility in the government to be able to change the school fee system. Unless they've done that I haven't heard about. I'm suspecting not.
We have another 15 minutes or so, so look forward to additional questions. Yes, please.
So two overlapping questions, historical and kind of social, structural. I'll preface it by saying I'm a historian, so I'm not.
Oh, good.
And I know you're not, but one of the things that strikes me is the way you frame this. It seems that it's an issue that the farmers haven't changed how they farm or what they farm over the past. You mentioned Karen Blixen was there in the teens and 20s.
Right.
But this area, this Aluya area. Right?
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
So that was not, that they had plentiful food 100 years ago. Maize wasn't introduced there probably until the 30s and 40s. So the sorghum was very common.
Mhm.
Intercropping was very common. There were flourishing markets. So part of the question is, I don't know that it's necessarily a lack of changing of technology as larger structural issues, attached to a cash economy where they need cash crops.
Right.
You talk about them, they wish they could have invested in land as a something you could buy and sell in that area, probably the 60s, 1970s, before you had land titles.
Yes,
Something
right.
you could do. And then kind of the structural issue, so you mentioned that just a little bit here at the end, and I think that's important. So the need for school fees, Kibaki in about 2003 or 4 eliminated school fees, and they come back in different ways. So it's, clearly there are technical changes that can take place to improve their situation, but I think framing it as simply they are technologically behind, I think does a disservice to them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I guess what I was that kind of the appearance when you visit those farms and see that the way they work, it's the words that I have, I think in the prologue of the book, I quote Karen Blixen's description of the Kikuyu, of my farmers, as she called them, my Kikuyu, that were working on her coffee farm. The description of them is basically Leonida and her working, and the same. So I just found that as, at least kind of this literary parallel to be quite striking. But yeah, a number of things have changed, but just in terms of kind of the technology that's just kind of also, available for them. When I first started talking about this book when it came out, I would have pictures, so the farmers and the hose, the djembe, and particularly the short-handled hose, and I would match that up with a picture of golfers on the PGA Tour who were using these putters that came up to their bellies to basically stabilize the yips or whatever was going on. And in the research that had gone into the titanium shafts and the drivers to hit the ball founder. So all this research that had gone on, like in our country and in the wealthy countries, on golf clubs, and nobody had spent anything basically coming up with a better hole for these farmers, because again, it's like they probably shouldn't be farming in the minds of the World Bank, and even the ag industry. Because part of the theory of structural adjustment then was, if the government gets out of those areas and gets out of the parastatal, stops their subsidies, even though we haven't and none of the rich countries had, but we were saying, you all stop your subsidies. Well, how do we do that? I don't know. Figure it out. Well, you haven't. Well, no, we're talking about you. So the general unfairness of that, but kind of all that was, kind of going on, then in those days, that just, kind of was this neglect of agriculture and the smallholder farmers. It was, I think it was like 20, 25 years. So every year, the World Bank puts out the World Development Report, which is their kind of signature report that kind of sets the trend for the global development industry. Here's one thing that the World Bank's focused on. Everybody then plows into doing that. In, I think it was 2007 or 2008, in the midst of the crisis, the food price and availability and surplus crisis, riots in dozens of countries because of prices were high and the shortages of food. There they came out with a report on agriculture as their signature global development report, and it was the first time they dealt with agriculture in 25 years. What else was the world's premier poverty reduction agency focusing on over those 25 years that wasn't agriculture, when that's what the majority of people in these countries do, the majority of food production at that time, and not to have done anything, in that period, where the jobs are. And so that's kind of this whole part of the history that then sets in, that these farmers then are basically caught up in, or this general neglect of things. So, I don't know, rambling thoughts. Does that kind of address what you were thinking of, or do you want me to?
Yes. I think it's just important, rather than, it's all, in some of these discussions, it can come off as these people are technologically backwards.
Yeah, no, exactly, right, no, right.
As opposed to 100 years ago, they could feed themselves.
Yes, exactly, right.
I think the word you're talking about, job, for the hunger season.
Right.
Which is a Swahili word, not a Luyu word.
Right.
Yes. So which,
And Jaz is Swahili, but then Wanjala is in the local word, so they put.
But the idea is that 100 years ago, could they feed themselves? And if so, what has changed? If the technology hasn't changed, what was the change?
Right.
That brought them to this point?
Right, and you're right. It would have been the cropping system back then, the crops that were grown, the intercropping, the reliance on cash crops or market crops as maize, which then becomes the staple crop. And so, all these crops that then were introduced. West Africa, the introduction of cotton. There's some of the best cotton producers in the world in terms of the quality of cotton, say, that comes out of West Africa. But there's no production of transforming the cotton from the raw cotton into anything. Even ginning mills, I think, are very, it all go to France or some other place. And that would land, so they would sell it on the global market the same as the American cotton that was subsidized to, a really high extent. And so, and that was supposed to be their cash crop. And their prices were consistently up and down, mainly down, because there they were on the global market competing under, just totally unfair circumstances with farmers in a different part of the world. And so, not to by any means that they're kind of technologically behind or inferior in a sense. It's basically that there was no emphasis on them or efforts to kind of alleviate that. And when you think of it, these farmers that they're able to accomplish anything, particularly in some parts of the world, like some of the places in Ethiopia that have been so denuded and soils that are so depleted that they're able to grow anything is remarkable. So these farmers in Western Kenya, in particular the 4 families that I followed, I have the highest regard for them of what they're able to do given what they have. And so that they're farming, they're some of the best farmers in the world. They know their climate, they know their surroundings, they know their soils. It's just, how do we start to have access to any of that if there was zero access to financing to begin with? And if there was access, it was at 50% interest rates that the loan sharks in the rural areas were charging. I think it's like Akin Adesina, who's now the head of the African Development Bank. When I first met him, he was at the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. He became Nigeria's agriculture minister. I think he had told me that it was like maybe 2 or 3% of all commercial lending in all of Africa went to the rural areas. No farmer in the world exists without some kind of financing, because how do you start? How do you start at the beginning of the season when your revenues aren't coming at least for 4 or 5 months later? Without that access to capital at the beginning, what do you do? And so that's the situation that a lot of Sephora, the year before, she only had enough to plant 1/4 of an acre. It was no fault of hers. It's just that she just had no resources to pay anything.
Ben?
Roger, curious if you ever had some of these social things, because the best farms, the most productive farms in Africa, and especially in the Western Highlands, are just as productive as our most efficient farms here. And many of the cut flowers sold in Europe are grown in Nakuru County, and so they have large-scale commercial agricultural uncover anything about the social dynamic between the, not the difference in class, but the difference in economic status in those counties? Because you can spend time there and not get off the main road and see people living on smallholder steads.
Right.
And you can see large commercial dairies. Did you ever uncover a sense of how somebody like this family views the more affluent, the larger scale, and what the sense of social responsibility is? There's a good sense of social responsibility that you talk about in the book with sharing labor and planning and access. But what about among the different economic classes?
Yeah.
In county?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and particularly because would also often get the question of, it's like, where does all this lead to in kind of the future of farming in Africa? Should all be like, big farming and commercial farming things, or somehow, we really scale the production of the smaller farmers, and well, they can do a lot. And, it always comes as with most things. I mean, the truth is in the middle. You need a combination of both, because that was part of the problem, that if they're not farming, where are they? They're in the urban areas. Who feeds the urban areas? And you need the larger commercial farms, but what are the investments for that? And then you have all kind of the environmental factors that go with it. I mean, now kind of the big farming, big ag in the United States always under attack and being assailed for a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions, for the soil depletion, for the fertilizer, for the pesticides, the herbicide use, the different crop varieties, the GMOs and chasing the farmers in the fields not to, plant. Again, these guys, if they are not keeping seed to be able to plant for the next season, they can be totally wiped out. And so they kind of have that, So then you have kind of those problems and issues that then arise if you kind of have this big explosion of commercial agriculture. So I think, it's obvious that they're both needed, both the big and the small. But I think what's lacking is a recognition of that. And so then for the bigger farmers and the commercial farmers, that not everything should be catered for them. So what one was finding, it was interesting. So with AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, and there's various criticisms that they'll get too. But one of the things that they were trying to do is really establish a network of local seed suppliers, small seed companies that could basically tailor their needs to these farmers who may just, they could be more mobile and move either to their farms or out to the areas. They don't have to go to the main commercial center where the traditional, the larger seed shops are catering to commercial farmers. What these smaller seed companies were able to do is, instead of a 50-kilo bag of seeds, they could do 2 kilos or 10. Instead of a 50-kilo bag of fertilizer, they could do 5 or 10, because that's all these farmers need. What are they going to do with a great big bag of fertilizer or seed when they don't even have the land to plant it all on? And so to basically to recognize that we have a need for both of them. We can't have a whole system that's built up and catering just to kind of the larger scale farmers, because they're the ones that can actually then, pay back the loans and pay back. The One Acre Fund basically has 99% repayment rates on their loans. I think Opportunity International, that also does a lot of rural lending to farmers in addition to like in the cities. They also have, I think they probably have higher rates of return in the rural areas, because particularly if they work in groups, there's a lot of peer pressure on them. They're all neighbors, they're in the same groups, they're kind of helping each other. And then it's a matter of, hey, you're dragging us down. You're not repaying. What's going on? We'll help you, kind of what do you need? And then there's incentive programs built up. So I think it's that, yeah. It also kind of addresses the kind of core kind of inequity and justice issues. So going forward, I think this next kind of Gordian knot to solve of nourishing the planet, preserving the planet at the same time, and the necessity that is, and what that requires of agriculture and everybody involved in it, is it's also these essential questions of equality and justice. And I think that's a way to kind of catalyze interest and movement in that. Because I've seen from my own kids, I think this generation, and they're both in their 20s, and a keen awareness of equality and justice issues and what's fair. And you guys have been dealing with that kind of from the time that you're small. and coming up in a really visceral manner, perhaps, and now with climate change and things, and that this just isn't, it's not right, it's not fair, it's not just. And so kind of continuing from the discussion this morning, that if that is all brought then to the agriculture area as well, because hunger is the essence of injustice and the beginning of inequality and inequity, that there's enough to eat. That's part of the title of the first book, kind of several meanings to it, but enough. We've had enough food in the world for a long time to feed everybody, enough calories in the world if equitably distributed, but it's not. And what's wrong with us that we don't assure and to make that happen? And so this disparity between the bigger farms, the more successful farms, oh yeah, they're commercially reliable. We can lend to them. They'll repay. We can build a whole infrastructure system that they can take advantage of. Who cares about these folks? Because they're not reliable. The really interesting thing is that when you go to any of these farms, and you guys have all seen this, they all have cell phones, right? So it's like, oh, cell phones, they'll revolutionize their lives. So what these farmers do, and Sephora now has one, maybe two, that yeah, they can punch in a couple of numbers and they can find the prices at this market, and that market. Yay! That's all dependent on, do they have a crop and a harvest sufficient enough that they have a surplus to sell? Otherwise, who cares if I got a phone that I can punch in numbers and find out the price of the market if I don't even have any food to sell because I don't even have enough to feed my family and conquer the hunger season. So that's why you start on this front, but that they all have phones, you know, is because the telecommunications companies recognized these farmers, they'll buy phones. They have enough money for that. What was going on with the ag industry? Global ag companies, country companies, that they never were that far out into the rural areas and figuring that, no, these farmers will buy the right kind of seeds for their farms. They will buy the small measures of fertilizer once they see how much that small microdosing can do and the effectiveness of it, because the seed, the fertilizer, these essential elements of farming are much more important in their lives than a cell phone. The cell phone basically helps magnify those things that would come from agriculture, kind of not the other way around. I mean, the cell phone isn't by itself going to make you have a better harvest, but the better harvest will allow you to have better use of the cell phone. And so why the ag industry and so that was the thing under structural adjustment. Governments get out of agriculture, get out of the subsidies, get out of the seed businesses, get out of the lending businesses. The private sector will do all that. One, the private sector was too immature in a lot of these countries. It wasn't into rural areas, and frankly, they didn't care. These smallholder farmers were too poor, too remote, too insignificant. Who cares about them? We got these commercial farmers in our countries. That's who will make the money from. So all these kind of insults and neglects then built up with these farmers, including then the insult of hunger and malnutrition. So all that's kind of working around it. And yeah, these entrepreneurs, the beer companies, Pepsi, Coke, and the cell phones, they're all out in these areas. Where's the ag companies? Where's the seed companies? They weren't there. And so they're there now. They realize that, yeah, they can, be successful with these farmers as well. So that's taken so long to do that. So that's kind of part of the historical things too, that it was just, who cared about them? So it's grand neglect. So
Thank you, Roger.
anyway, do we have?
One thing that's changed from the last time you did this is probably the climate and
We should
Sorry, I
probably
knew
hold
I
that, yeah. So please stay afterward, but I do want to respect people's time. And I want first to say thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you for your great questions. To my list of colleagues that I thanked at the beginning, I want to add one name. I want to thank Ozzy Abai for also playing an instrumental role in making this a success. And our intern, Maddie Dines, also.
Yay.
One reason I'm not good at thanking, I always forget important people. So, thank you, Ann, for helping me remember that. Thank you, Guru, for leading the question and answer time. And
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity and for all your work. Thank you.
Bought some of his books that are for sale for probably less than a third of what you would pay on Amazon.
Yes.
And he'll even sign them.
Yes. And Maddie's been schlepping them around the place, so please relieve her burden and buy the books, right? So thank you. I'll sign them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Roger, thank you.
Thank you. Did that help your class or your students in thinking on stuff?
You brought up something that I thought very interesting at the end in that last answer. Of a lot of small farmers, they're in communication a lot. They can't afford things in bulk. You're a step away from creating a co-op. And that's, again, something that we did 75 or 80 years ago here. That really transformed American agriculture with input co-ops and marketing co-ops. Is that something that's possible or even happening in Africa?
Yeah, and in parts of Africa, so in Kenya, they had a co-op.